Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're looking at, well, a really monumental cultural legacy. It spans 1,000 years, maybe more. We're trying to distill its story, the incredible art of the Caddo Nation.
It's a story rooted deep in the American South, an artistic tradition that faced just catastrophic historical loss. But then, almost miraculously, it was reborn through this heroic three-phase effort.
And it's crucial, isn't it, to frame this right from the start. We're not just talking about, old potsherds in a museum case.
Exactly, not just artifacts. We're really examining one of the most sophisticated, aesthetically accomplished indigenous ceramic traditions in all of North America. The main timeline for CaddoPottery runs, like you said, over millennium, roughly 800 CE, right up until the mid-19th century.
That sheer length of time it's staggering. So our mission today, for you listening, is to really gain a thorough understanding of this Caddo ceramic tradition. I want to focus not just on the, let's say, the beautiful
And technique is incredible.
Oh, absolutely. But also on the complex social world, the cosmology that sort of demanded this level of high art, and then the really specific historical forces that caused it to stop so abruptly.
And crucially, the powerful modern renaissance that brought it back. It's like a material record, you could say, of an enduring cultural identity written in clay.
That's a great way to put it. The narrative arc here feels like one of just profound continuity, but also maybe even more profound resilience.
It really is. It takes us from this stable, thriving mound-building society right through the trauma of dispossession, forced removal, and then culminates in this powerful 20th and now 21st century revival, sparked initially by artists like Geraldine Redcorn.
Okay, so let's unpack this from the ground up. Our sources really emphasize a key insight we have to start with. The sheer quality, the consistency of Caddo pottery, it was fundamentally a product of, well, profound territorial stability.
That stability is. It's kind of the central organizing principle of Caddo history, at least in their ancestral homeland. Unlike many indigenous groups, maybe on the plains or in the Great Basin, who had seasonal movements or were forced into later migrations, the Caddo occupied basically the same geography.
Right.
Centered on the Red River Valley, spanning parts of what we now call East Texas, Southwest Arkansas, West Louisiana, Southeast Oklahoma, for over 1,000 continuous years.
Okay, so let's put ourselves in the potter's shoes. If you're living generation after generation unbroken in the same place,
Yeah.
what does that actually mean for your craft?
It means everything. It translates into an unparalleled, cumulative, just deeply intimate knowledge of the local resources, the physical stuff. Generation after generation, the teaching lineages, they stayed intact. Potters knew exactly where the specific high-quality clay deposits were in their territory. They knew precisely which types of tempering agents, whether it was crushed shell or grog, crushed pottery, worked best for different kinds of vessels. They even knew the unique burning characteristics of the local woods for firing.
So this wasn't just like accidental excellence happening over time. It was deep, specialized knowledge, almost like intellectual property tied to a very specific place.
Precisely. It elevated the craft. It went beyond just making pots you needed to becoming a true, specialized high art form. This environmental intimacy, this cultural continuity, it allowed the Caddo to achieve this incredibly thin-walled refinement, this intricate engraved detail. It really rivals any ceramic tradition in North America.
Right. So our roadmap for this deep dive is set. First, we need to fully appreciate this complex, stable Caddo world. Then we'll get into the astonishing artistry, the cosmology that's literally baked into the clay. And finally, we trace that powerful story, how the tradition was lost and how it was reborn.
Sounds like a plan.
Let's dive into part I then, the world of the Caddo, this complex, resourceful society built on that stability we just talked about.
Yeah, by the time Europeans arrived, this was definitely not a simple, small-scale society. It was a really sophisticated network, at least 25 distinct communities that we know of, organized into three main confederacies: the Hasinai, the Caddo and the Natchitoches. And importantly, it was a socially ranked theocracy.
Meaning the spiritual and the political weren't really separate things.
Not at all. Deeply interwoven, highly structured. At the very top, the spiritual apex, you had the Senesi. This was a hereditary spiritual leader. Their role was absolutely critical. They were the mediator between the community and the supreme god, Caddo, the ultimate link, you might say, to the cosmic order.
Okay, so the Senesi at the top. What about day-to-day life?
Well, below the Senesi, civil life in each community was governed by the Cadi. This was the principal headman. He managed political affairs, but he consulted with the Kanahas, a council of elders, basically, revered for their wisdom and experience.
So you've got this hereditary spiritual authority kind of guiding the big picture cosmic connection, and then a consultative civil authority managing daily life. How did pottery, especially the fancy stuff, fit into that structure?
The fineware pottery was indispensable. It functioned as, well, as a material culture that mediated between these leaders. The most refined vessels, those beautiful bottles, the carinated bowls we'll talk about, they were used in the most important ceremonies, the ones conducted by the Senesi. And they were often the prized possessions placed in the graves of the elite, like the caddy.
So tangible status symbols.
Exactly. They demonstrated access to surplus wealth, to ceremonial knowledge. So the production of these ritual objects was actually critical to maintaining the entire social order.
And we absolutely have to emphasize the role of women here. Caddo society, fundamentally matrilineal, that gave women huge influence, didn't it?
Immense social and economic influence.
Well,
This is crucial context for understanding who the Potters likely were. Descent, clan affiliation, it was all traced exclusively through the mother's line. This structure automatically granted women high status, significant power. For instance, elder women controlled the essential physical structures, those large dome-shaped grass houses where the extended families lived. And even more importantly, they controlled the agricultural fields.
which means they control the food source, the economic base.
Absolutely. And they were highly successful farmers, maize, beans, squash, sunflowers. This very productive agricultural economy generated the surplus resources needed to support craft specialization, people who didn't have to farm every single day.
Allowing for potters, weavers, other specialists.
Precisely. And it supported population growth. This success also allowed them to maintain these vast trade networks. We're talking connections from the Great Lakes all the way west to New Mexico. Caddo women, as the custodians of both the food supply and probably the primary trade commodity, this high-quality pottery, they really sat at a major crossroads of social and economic power.
Okay, let's trace the timeline a bit. From that thriving, stable society towards the eventual catastrophe, the classic period first.
Right, from about 1000 CE to maybe 1700 CE, Caddo culture really coalesced into what archaeologists call the Caddoan Mississippian culture. This era is defined by those immense, planned civic ceremonial centers and the large earthen mounds used for temples, for elite burials, iconic sites like the Caddo Mounds State Historic Site in Texas.
And pottery was central throughout this time.
Absolutely central, the primary medium for artistic, symbolic, spiritual expression.
But that 1,000-year stability, it starts to fracture with European contact.
Yeah, the initial sort of fracture point is often marked by the Hernando de Soto expedition way back in 1541. Though really sustained contact, it didn't ramp up until the late 17th century with French and Spanish competition in the region.
And the diseases.
Oh, the introduction of Old World diseases, measles, smallpox, it was catastrophic. The Caddo had zero immunity. It led to immense population decline, which inevitably stressed their social structures, their teaching lineages, everything.
Yet, despite that terrible tragedy, they initially showed incredible resilience, didn't they? They navigated the complex politics of the borderlands pretty skillfully for a while.
They really did. They were masterful diplomats, smart traders. They used the competition between the French, the Spanish, and later the Anglo-Americans to their advantage for nearly 2 centuries. But even that skilled diplomacy, it couldn't hold back the tide indefinitely, especially once the U.S. started expanding westward. The real pressure cooker started after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803.
That brought the relentless pressure of Anglo-American settlement right to their doorstep.
And it irrevocably destabilized their land base. There was systematic dispossession, culminating in that devastating 1835 treaty, forcing them to give up their Louisiana territory. They were just continuously pushed west, confined to a reservation on the Brazos River in Texas in 1855. And then came the final, traumatic, defining act of severance.
The forced removal of 1859.
Yes. Around 1,050 Caddo people were violently removed by the U.S. government from Texas, driven north, forced onto the Washita River in Indian Territory, what's now Oklahoma. That event, 1859, it's the precise, identifiable point when that 1,000-year continuous Caddo pottery tradition just stopped immediately.
Okay, so we know that by the mid-19th century, the Caddo were starting to adopt metal pots from traders, things like that. But you're arguing very strongly that the tradition didn't just fade away because metal was available. It was aggressively severed by that removal.
Yeah.
Why is that event the specific traumatic cause?
Because CaddoPottery at its heart was land-based knowledge. The art of making that fine pottery, it required generations of knowledge tied to specific clay beds. The unique clays of the piney woods in the Red River Valley. The forced march to Oklahoma physically cut the people off from those ancestral sources of material.
They lost the earth itself.
Exactly. In Oklahoma, they encountered completely new environments, new clays with different properties. All the knowledge passed down for a millennium was instantly rendered, well, useless in a practical sense because the core materials were gone.
Wow.
And that profound physical disruption combined with the extreme hardship, the federal assimilation policies that followed, it shattered the stable social structures that were necessary for such a complex, time-consuming craft. Those matrilineal teaching lineages, mother to daughter, they couldn't prioritize meticulous fineware production when the community was just fighting for basic survival in a new, often hostile environment.
And the timing is so precise.
It really is. The very last traditional caddo pots we know of were made in the 1850s, right before that final forced removal. It marks that event as the hard, clear endpoint of the continuous tradition. It's a story of loss that is fundamentally geographic.
That geographical link is,
Yeah.
it's heartbreaking. But it also powerfully frames the whole revival story we're going to get to as a literal and symbolic reclamation of that ancestral earth.
It absolutely does. And the revival artists, they understand that deeply. Reclaiming the tradition means reclaiming the soil itself in many ways.
Okay, moving now to part 2, the ancestral pottery tradition itself. Let's really get deep into the technical skill, the archaeology of this excellence. What does the archaeological record tell us about the caddo potter's skill level?
Well, it tells us they were highly specialized and technologically really quite sophisticated. We can clearly divide the vast amount of pottery they produced into 2 broad categories. And this distinction, it gives us a major social insight. We see the utilitarian wares and then the highly refined fine wares.
And what does that distinction, having both everyday pots and these super fancy ones, imply about caddo society?
Well, the very existence of 2 distinct classes like that implies, first, a resource surplus. You need enough food and security for some people to dedicate time to non-essential, highly skilled tasks. And second, it implies social stratification.
Right.
Utilitarian wares were the sturdy workhorse pots. You know, thicker walls, often with coarse tempering like crushed mussel shell. Sometimes the surface was brushed or pinched to give you a better grip. That we were for cooking, for storage. Basic needs.
But the fine wares.
The fine wares were different. Thin-walled, sometimes incredibly thin, made with exceptionally fine temper, meticulously polished, burnished to this beautiful sheen. These were labor-intensive objects designed primarily for status display and for ritual use.
You just don't expend that kind of intense labor unless you have a society that can support specialists and that has rituals requiring these kinds of prestige items.
Precisely. The fine wares were definite status markers. They were buried with the elite, used in complex ceremonies. Their presence in the archaeological record is material proof of a socially stratified theocracy, one that supported professional craft specialization.
Let's talk about the shapes, the forms that really defined caddo pottery for centuries.
Okay, 2 forms are instantly recognizable as caddo. First, the bottle. It typically has this globular body and then that very long, distinctive, slender neck. Excellent for pouring liquids, obviously, but as we'll see, the form itself carried immense symbolic weight.
And the second key shape.
The carinated vessel. The name carinated refers to a sharp angle or keel. So these are bowls or bottles where the profile has a sharp, angular turn. The wall flares out horizontally or nearly so, and then turns sharply inward toward the rim. It's a very deliberate, controlled shape.
And these weren't just passing fads. These forms were culturally preferred and technically mastered over 1,000 years.
Exactly, enduring shapes.
And the reason we can study so many beautiful, intact pieces today is directly tied to how they were used after death, right? Their funerary significance.
Yes, absolutely. The caddo tradition of placing whole vessels, often these beautiful fine wares in graves, is the primary reason so many have survived intact for us to study. These mortuary vessels, well, they might have contained food or drink, sustenance for the soul's journey, or maybe they were simply prized personal possessions that the deceased carried with them into the spirit world.
Okay, let's get rigorously technical now. Let's reconstruct the chaîne opératoire, the step-by-step operational sequence for a caddo potter. Start with the materials and the tempering, because the material science here sounds critical.
It is. The starting point was always locally harvested, high-quality clay. They knew where the good stuff was. But the real key to their durability and refinement was adding a non-plastic temper. This is some kind of material mixed into the clay.
And why add temper? What does it do?
It basically helps the clay survive the drying and firing process. Pure clay can shrink too much or crack easily. Temper adds strength and reduces that shrinkage.
And the Caddo choice of temper actually tells a chronological story you mentioned.
It does. During the early period, say before 1300 CE or so, the favored tempering material was grog. That's crushed fragments of old pottery sherds.
Wow, so they were literally putting the past into the new pots.
Exactly. Our sources suggest this was likely a really profound symbolic practice. You're essentially incorporating ancestral vessels' ancestral substance into the new ones you're creating. It physically embodies continuity. Pulverized animal bone was also used sometimes.
That's fascinating. But then around 1300 CE, we see a technical shift in the temper.
Correct. The use of burned and crushed freshwater mussel shell becomes increasingly common, especially for the utilitarian wares, the cooking pots.
Why the change? Was shell better somehow?
It's a really interesting shift. While grog offered that powerful symbolic connection to the ancestors, shell is arguably a superior technical temper, particularly for pots that need to withstand repeated heating and cooling, like cooking pots. Shell seems to resist thermal shock better, allows for greater durability.
So the potters were making a calculated choice, balancing symbolic tradition with practical, technological efficiency.
It looks that way. As the society and economy perhaps grew more complex, maybe durability for everyday wares became a higher priority. They were clearly sophisticated material scientists experimenting and adapting.
Okay, so they've prepared the clay with temper.
Mm.
How are these vessels actually constructed? We know there is no potter's wheel.
Right, entirely handmade. They used the coil method, which is pretty universal across cultures without the wheel. The potter would start with a base, maybe a flat disc of clay, or sometimes a tightly pinched coil to start the bottom. Then they'd build the walls up by adding long, rope-like fillets or coils of clay, one on top of the other.
And just pinching them together.
Pinching and blending them seamlessly, that's the skill.
But how did they achieve those incredibly thin, smooth, consistent walls we see in the fine wares without the mechanical aid of a wheel to even things out?
This is where their mastery really shows. Once the basic coil structure was built up, the potter would thin and shape the walls using specialized tools and techniques. On the exterior, they might use a smooth stone or a piece of wood to scrape and smooth. But the key was often using something called an internal anvil.
An anvil, like for metalworking.
Sort of, but for clay. It would be maybe a smooth river pebble, a piece of broken pottery, or even a dried gourd held firmly against the inside wall. As they paddled, scraped, or rubbed the exterior surface with one hand, the internal anvil supported the clay wall from the inside.
Ah, I see. So they could apply pressure to thin and compact the clay uniformly without it collapsing inward.
Exactly. It allowed them to stretch the clay, compact the particles, and achieve those remarkably thin and even walls. It's an exhausting, physically demanding process that requires immense patience, consistency, and skill. Real artistry.
Okay, walls built and thinned. Now let's move to the decoration, which is really the signature of Caddo high art. It seems like a multi-stage process, depending on how dry the clay was.
It was. If the clay was still quite wet, still plastic, you could use incising. That means cutting lines into the surface with a sharp tool, maybe a sharpened bone, or a flint flake. This tends to result in a softer, sometimes slightly ragged groove because the wet clay particles get pushed aside or tear a little.
And utilitarian pieces might get simpler decoration at this stage.
Yes, things like brushing the surface with a bundle of grass or pinching it with fingers to create texture for grip. Quicker methods for everyday pots.
But for the fine wares, the surface preparation before firing was meticulous, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The focus was on achieving surface perfection. They often coated the vessel, when it was maybe lead or hard, with a slip. That's a very thin wash of superfine clay, sometimes colored with pigments like red ochre. And then came the really laborious part, burnishing.
Rubbing it with a stone.
Yes, rubbing the surface repeatedly, patiently, firmly, with a smooth, highly polished stone. Usually done when the clay was leather-hard, firm enough to hold its shape, but still retaining a bit of moisture. Burnishing does more than just create that deep, beautiful, lustrous sheen.
What else does it do?
It compacts the surface clay particles, aligns them flat. This makes the surface much less porous, which is vital if the vessel is meant to hold liquids. It's both aesthetic and functional.
And then we arrive at the technical hallmark, engraving. You stressed earlier this is different from incising. How so?
Engraving is fundamentally different because of when it's done and the result. It's a process of carving intricate designs, again, using a sharp tool, but this time when the clay is either fully leather hard or, and this is even more technically demanding, after the vessel has been completely fired and is now hard ceramic.
So you're carving into hard material, not pushing soft clay aside.
Exactly. Because the clay is hardened, the tool can't just push the particles aside like in sizing. It has to actually cut or carve them away. This results in a line that is infinitely finer, crisper, cleaner, and much more controlled than the lines you can get from incising wet clay. This incredible precision and fineness of line is what truly distinguishes Caddo fineware engraving.
And to make those super fine engraved lines really stand out against the dark polished surface, they employed color contrast.
Yes, a final, really elegant, labor-intensive touch. After engraving, the potters would often rub mineral pigments, typically white kaolin clay, or sometimes red ochre, directly into those finely carved lines.
Like filling them in.
Precisely. They'd rub it all over the engraved area, making sure the pigment got down into every groove. Then they'd carefully wipe the excess pigment off the smooth, burnished surface. The result: the design would stand out vividly, bright white or red lines against that highly polished, dark backdrop. It creates a breathtaking visual effect. Just stunning.
Incredible detail. Okay, the final step in the chain operatoire,
Yes.
firing. They managed to control the color and atmosphere pretty precisely, even without modern enclosed kilns.
They really mastered atmosphere control using only open bonfires or maybe shallow pit firings. The temperatures were relatively low compared to modern kilns, probably around 600 to 700 degrees Celsius, maybe a bit higher sometimes. The final color of the pot was largely a function of oxygen control during that firing.
Okay, explain that. Oxidation versus reduction.
Sure. If the fire had ample oxygen, basically, if it burned freely, that's an oxidation atmosphere. This typically yielded buff, tan, or reddish-brown surface colors on the pottery.
But for those classic dark fine wares.
For the desired dark gray or rich, lustrous black surfaces, they needed a reduction atmosphere. They achieved this by smothering the fire, usually towards the end of the firing, maybe with damp grass, manure, or extra wood. This deliberately deprived the fire of oxygen.
And that lack of oxygen turns the clay dark.
Yes, it changes the chemistry of the iron compounds in the clay, turning them black or gray instead of red or brown. It's a controlled chemical process achieved just through managing the fire.
Amazing control. Okay, let's connect all this incredible technique back to the meaning. You said these weren't just decorative motifs. They were essentially cosmograms, abstract, geometric symbols representing the entire Caddo universe.
They absolutely were. A symbolic language rendered in clay. The vessels weren't just containers for food or water. They were philosophical statements, models of the cosmos. The Caddo conceived the universe as being three-tiered. There was the upper world, home to celestial beings, the middle world, which was the realm of human existence, and the watery underworld below.
And you mentioned the bottle form in particular could physically embody this cosmology. Can you help us visualize that? It's a complex idea.
Okay, think of the pot itself as a physical, three-dimensional model of the Caddo universe. These three worlds, they believed, were connected by a central conduit, a sacred pole or tree, the axis mundi.
The world axis.
Right. So the base of the bottle, resting on the earth, symbolized the watery lower world. The main globular body of the bottle represented the middle world, where humans lived and interacted. And then that long, slender neck symbolized the sacred pole, the axis mundi, reaching upwards, connecting the middle world to the upper world above.
Wow. So to create a Caddo bottle wasn't just making a container, it was literally recreating a miniature universe, embodying their entire cosmological structure.
Exactly. It dramatically elevates the meaning and purpose of the craft, doesn't it? It's sacred geometry.
It really does. So let's look at some of the specific motifs they engraved onto these cosmograms. What did common elements like circles and spirals represent?
Those are ubiquitous, not just in Caddo art, but across much of the Mississippian world. Circles, scrolls, spirals, often organized in patterns of four. They frequently symbolize the four-quartered structure of the world, the concept of a sacred center. Spirals and flowing, curved lines often represented cyclical passage, the seasons, the journey of the soul, maybe the movement of ceremonial dance. They reflected ideas of continuity and movement within the cosmos.
And how did they represent the inhabitants or forces of the upper and lower world specifically?
Well, upper world motifs were often associated with powerful bird-like beings, sometimes called the Thunderers. These are often depicted quite abstractly. You might see stylized avian characteristics, pendant triangles, or scalloped rims on vessels that seem to suggest feathers or wings. They signify the powerful forces of the sky, lightning, rain.
Okay. And the lower world?
Conversely, lower world motifs often corresponded to patterns associated with powerful serpent beings, the rulers of the watery realm beneath the earth. So on the pottery, you might look for elements like dense cross-hatching, parallel bars, chevrons. These are often interpreted as representing scales or the skin patterns of those sacred serpents.
So abstract patterns conveying very specific cosmological ideas.
Yes, highly symbolic.
And our sources even mention a really rare, highly specialized effigy pot that seems to combine several symbols in a very complex way.
Ah, yes. There's a famous head effigy bottle dated to the 1600s. It features this incredibly complex symbol carved around one eye. Scholars have interpreted it as simultaneously representing a bird wing, a raptorial bird like a falcon, and a human hand, all layered together.
That's incredibly dense symbolism.
It is. It likely conveys very sophisticated, layered meanings about maybe death, transformation, the passage between the physical world and the spirit world. It's a powerful reminder that Caddo iconography was anything but simple decoration. It was deep theology expressed visually.
Okay, transitioning now to the makers themselves. The evidence, you said, overwhelmingly suggests that pottery production was primarily the domain of women, passed down through that matrilineal line.
That's the strong consensus, yeah. Reinforced by the whole social structure we discussed. This complex knowledge, everything from finding the right clay to preparing it to building, decorating, firing it, was most likely transmitted directly from mother to daughter, or maybe aunt to niece, generation after generation.
And the archaeology supports this, seeing masters and learners.
It does. When archaeologists excavate a Caddo village site, they often find evidence of different skill levels existing side by side. You'll find the expertly made, thin-walled, beautifully decorated pots right alongside cruder, thicker, less refined attempts, possibly the work of learners practicing the craft under the guidance of masters.
This really places the Caddo woman potter at a major nexus of power in her society, one we absolutely cannot underestimate.
Absolutely. Within that matrilineal system, women were the custodians of cultural identity. They were key economic actors, producing this highly valued trade commodity, the pottery, that sustained those vast exchange networks. And crucially, they held significant ritual power. They were the creators of the sacred fineware vessels that the male spiritual and political leaders, the Sinisi and the Cadi, needed to perform their duties, validate their status, and mediate with the cosmos.
So the women were, in a very real sense, the enablers of the entire spiritual and political hierarchy through their craft.
You could certainly argue that their role was fundamental.
Is this exclusively female, though, or is there any archaeological hint of nuance there?
Well, there is one really compelling note of nuance that comes up in our sources. It relates to the Ferguson site, which is in southwest Arkansas. Archaeologists there discovered a grave containing what really appeared to be a specialized potter's toolkit. It included things like lumps of unfired clay, polishing pebbles, maybe some decorating tools.
Okay.
And this kit was buried with an adult male.
Ah.
It is. It opens up the intriguing possibility that while the Caddo pottery tradition was overwhelmingly sustained, taught, and probably governed by women, perhaps men occasionally participated too, maybe as specialists focusing on very specific, highly ritualized forms of fineware. It's a question mark, but it complicates a simple, absolute gender division.
Fascinating detail. Okay, before we move on to the modern revival, which is such a powerful story, we need to address a specific point for you, our listener. It concerns the Felsenthal National Wildlife Refuge near Crossett, Arkansas, and its deep connection to the Caddo past.
Yes, this is an important point because it connects directly back to the sacred nature of the landscape we've been discussing and how that relates to the pottery and its protection today. Our sources absolutely confirm that the Felsenthal NWR is an intensely rich Caddo cultural landscape. It hosted Caddo farming settlements for centuries, roughly 900 to 1600 CE. There are over 200 known Caddo archaeological sites within the refuge boundaries, villages, camps, even ceremonial temple mounds.
Right. Yet if you try to find detailed reports or pictures of specific pottery found at those exact Felsenthal sites, it can often be difficult to find much publicly available information. This is an important lesson in modern cultural resource management, isn't it?
It really is. The lack of detailed public reporting, especially from sites on federal land like a national wildlife refuge, illustrates a significant modern shift in priorities. This shift is driven largely by federal laws like NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and other historic preservation mandates.
So the priority isn't necessarily excavation and academic publication anymore.
Not always, no. Often, especially on protected federal lands, the primary mandate is in situ preservation. That means leaving the cultural resources, the sites, the artifacts, the burials where they are undisturbed in the ground.
Protecting them rather than digging them up.
Exactly. And this is always done in rigorous consultation with the affiliated tribal nations, in this case, primarily the Caddo Nation of Oklahoma. The government and the tribe work together, and the priority becomes safeguarding these non-renewable, sacred, ancestral sites from threats like illegal digging, vandalism, erosion, and looting.
So those 200-plus sites at Felsenthal represent an invaluable protected heritage landscape.
An incredibly valuable one. And keeping the specific details of what's found there somewhat private is actually part of the strategy to ensure their long-term survival and respect their sacred nature. In this context, the protection of the ancestral earth and what it contains is often prioritized over the immediate publication of its material contents for academic or public consumption. It's about responsible stewardship in partnership with the descendants.
That makes perfect sense. Thank you for clarifying that. So that landscape, so defined by stability, then loss, then protection, it now becomes the stage for this incredible story of resilience. This brings us to part 3, a tradition reborn. After 1859, as you said, the tradition lay dormant for over 130 years. The link was just fundamentally broken.
It was. But the revival story, it's really a masterpiece of cultural tenacity. And it unfolds, interestingly, in what you could see as 3 distinct yet interconnected phases: reclamation, transmission, and innovation.
Okay, let's start with phase 1, reclamation. This seems to hinge on the singular vision and dedication of one person, Geraldine Jerry Redcorn.
Jerry Redcorn, yes. Caddo and Potawatomi heritage. She was an educator born in 1939, and the pivotal moment, the spark, occurred in June of 1991. She visited the Museum of the Red River in Idabel, Oklahoma.
What happened there?
Well, she encountered the museum's collection of ancestral CaddoPottery. Hundreds of these exquisitely refined, beautiful pots made by her ancestors, and she was just floored, awestruck by the beauty, yes, but also stunned and frankly deeply saddened that this incredible 1,000-year artistic legacy was utterly unknown to her own people. Even the tribal elders who were with her that day didn't know this history, didn't know Caddo people had made these things.
Wow. That must have been a powerful, maybe painful moment.
Mm.
When the past speaks so directly to the present, revealing a loss, what did she decide to do?
She and the group she was with, they basically made a collective promise right then and there. They would learn how to do it, they would make CaddoPottery once again, but the problem was huge. There was no living master potter to teach them. The lineage had been broken for over a century.
So how do you even start?
She had to embark on this journey that was essentially experimental archaeology, driven by deep cultural and spiritual dedication. She started by studying the pots themselves firsthand in museum collections, meticulously analyzing their forms, their construction, their decoration. She consulted with archaeologists who had studied Caddo sites. And then, crucially, she began the incredibly painstaking trial and error process of actually trying to master the ancient techniques herself.
Can you give us a sense of the sheer difficulty of that reclamation? She had to rediscover the entire chain operatoire from scratch, basically?
Pretty much. She had to figure out how to process the clay. She had to master the coiling technique, often working with her brother, apparently. She had to teach herself the meticulous, time-consuming process of stone burnishing to get that finish. She had to learn the intricate engraving methods by looking at the originals. And perhaps most challenging of all was the firing.
Right, recreating that controlled atmosphere without a kiln.
Exactly. With her husband, Charles, she had to essentially redevelop the traditional open-pit firing process, learning through endless experimentation how to control the atmosphere, manage the heat, achieve those perfect black reduction surfaces without the pots cracking or failing. Apparently, they failed hundreds of times before they started succeeding consistently.
She literally had to become the living link herself, didn't she? Single-handedly reviving this incredibly complex lost art based purely on studying the material record and relentless experimentation.
Yes, and her work, consequently, is defined by this deep reverence, this faithful adherence to those ancestral methods. She often speaks about it as a journey with my ancestors. Her success was eventually recognized internationally. Her work is now in major collections like the Smithsonian Institution. It was even exhibited in the White House during the Clinton administration.
That's incredible.
But her truly monumental achievement, beyond the beautiful pots she made, was creating that secure, living link to the past again, reviving the knowledge so it could be transmitted to the next generation, ensuring it wouldn't be lost again.
That transmission work brings us perfectly to phase 2. Chase Collinhut Earls. You describe him as the dedicated traditionalist.
Yes, Earlis is a direct student of Jerry Redcorn, and he really embodies the critical work of solidifying that revived knowledge base. His focus is on uncompromising rigor and authenticity. He sees his role as ensuring the ancestral flames, that everlasting fire concept, remain pure. He actively resists the temptation of using modern shortcuts or materials when doing traditional work.
And how rigorous is he when it comes to the materials? Since we identify the loss of access to ancestral clay as the key reason the tradition died out.
He treats the materials with profound respect, almost reverence. He personally travels back to the Caddo ancestral heartland along the Red River, the White River, the Washita River, to harvest his own clay, just like his ancestors did. He gathers freshwater mussel shells from the riverbeds, which he then burns and crushes by hand for temper. He completely bypasses commercially available clays and tempers for his traditional work.
So his entire process is a physical, almost spiritual return to the ancestral land and materials.
It absolutely is. He uses the hand coil method, meticulous stone burnishing, and importantly, he uses open pit bonfire firing for his traditional pieces, completely eschewing the modern electric kiln for that work.
And his iconography, the designs he engraves.
They mirror the ancient cosmology we discussed. He engraves designs drawn directly from that ancient symbolic language, focusing on motifs like feathers, serpents, the sun and moon, spirals, and especially that central Caddo concept of the everlasting fire, which represents their continuity and endurance.
And he makes a clear distinction in his work.
Yes, he's very careful about this, and it's important for educating the public and collectors. He consciously separates his strictly traditional work, which uses only ancestral materials, methods, and firing, from what he calls his contemporary pieces. Those might use commercial clays or be fired in a kiln for practicality, but they still rely on the foundational Caddo forms, the hand coil method, and traditional design inspiration. This clear distinction helps authenticate and preserve the integrity of the original, incredibly demanding process. He's a vital educator and authenticator in that sense.
Okay, so Redcorn reclaimed it, Earls transmits and authenticates it. Which brings us to phase 3. Innovation. Raven Halfbone. She takes this revived tradition and transforms it into something utterly contemporary and, frankly, monumental.
Yes, Raven Halfmoon, who is of Caddo and Delaware descent, also learned the fundamentals of CaddoPottery from elders in the community, building on that revived knowledge. But she moves radically beyond simple replication or traditional scale. She uses the same traditional Caddo coil method as her foundational technique, but she applies it to create these colossal stoneware sculptures.
Colossal how?
I mean, pieces that can soar up to 12 feet tall, weighing hundreds, sometimes thousands of pounds.
Wow, that scale itself is a profound statement. It transforms the historical pottery tradition into a completely new form of monumentality.
It absolutely does. It challenges the very definition of what Caddo ceramics can be. It's a powerful act of asserting a large, visible, contemporary indigenous presence in the art world and beyond. Her work clearly honors her ancestors, particularly the strength and power of the matrilineal lineage of Caddo women, but it does so on an entirely new, unavoidable public scale.
And her surface treatment is quite different too, isn't it? Intentionally expressive, not burnished smooth like the fine wares.
Exactly. She intentionally leaves the marks of her process highly visible. You see these deep finger impressions from the coiling. You see gestural drips of glaze, sometimes cracks that occur in the firing. This approach presences the artist's hand, emphasizes the sheer physicality required to wrestle these massive forms into existence.
And her color palette is symbolic too.
Yes, she often employs a symbolic palette of red, black, and cream or white. These colors directly reference the red ancestral earth of the Caddo homeland, the dark reduction-fired clays of the ancient pottery, and the pigments used in ancient iconography.
And she connects this ancient form, this ancestral strength, directly to pressing modern political and social issues.
Absolutely. She explicitly uses the monumental nature and the inherent strength conveyed by her massive female figures to address the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, the MMIW crisis.
How does the work make that connection?
By creating these incredibly powerful, assertive, large-scale female forms rooted in Caddo tradition, she creates a stark contrast. She highlights the high status, the authority, the recognized power held by ancestral Caddo women within their society, and contrasts that with the contemporary vulnerability, violence, and systemic neglect faced by Indigenous women today. She uses the resilience embedded in the clay itself, a tradition that survived the trauma of removal, to demand visibility, remembrance, and justice for her community now.
So by fusing these deep ancestral ties with influences from maybe graffiti art, contemporary fashion, even pop culture, she demonstrates that once a tradition is securely reestablished, it becomes this dynamic, evolving language,
Yeah.
capable of addressing the most urgent, difficult issues of the present moment.
That is the absolute definition of a living, breathing, relevant tradition. Not just replicating the past, but using its strength to speak to the now and the future.
This entire incredible story, stretching from the stability of 800 CE right through to 21st century monumental sculpture, it really is perfectly summarized by that metaphor you mentioned, the everlasting fire.
It truly is the unifying concept, I think. CaddoPottery, as we've seen, was utility, it was a status marker, a trade commodity, and a sacred cosmogram all at once. The everlasting fire of Caddo belief, culture, and identity was meticulously tended, primarily by Caddo women, for centuries. It was almost fatally extinguished by the trauma of forced removal, by that physical severing from the ancestral earth and its materials.
But the embers weren't completely cold. They were found somehow and painstakingly rekindled by the dedication of Jerry Redcorn, requiring decades of intense experimental work.
Exactly. And today, that fire burns brightly again. It's carefully tended by preservationists and traditionalists like Chase Cowan-Hutt Earls, who ensure the ancestral methods and materials remain pure and unbroken. And at the same time, it's being used in new ways by innovators like Raven Halfmoon, who takes that same heat and light to forge entirely new, powerful statements that both profoundly honor the past and speak fiercely, unforgettably to the future.
The unbroken coil of clay, then, truly connects the ancient mounds of the Red River Valley to the modern studios and galleries of Oklahoma and beyond. This incredibly sophisticated ceramic tradition, it's clearly not just a historical footnote, not just something to be studied in museum archives. It is a dynamic, living, and, as Half Moon shows, politically potent language being spoken right now.
And perhaps this raises a final provocative question for you, the listener, to consider as you process this deep dive we've taken today. What other forms of ancestral knowledge, maybe their languages, maybe agricultural techniques, ecological wisdom, architectural methods, knowledge systems that were seemingly lost or broken due to historical trauma, colonization, forced assimilation? Which of those are currently lying dormant, perhaps waiting in archives, in oral histories, in museum collections, or even embedded in the land itself, for a single dedicated individual or maybe a small group to begin that meticulous, patient, experimental work of reclamation?
That thought about reclamation, potential, and resilience is indeed a powerful place to end. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today into the heart of the Caddo world and its everlasting fire.